Have you ever wondered why some people just don't seem to care about a warning that a major storm is coming their way? Rather than do everything in their power to avoid loss of their home or their lives, they seem to simply just ignore the information. Do they think that there's no point to doing anything because the storm will overpower them? Or do they think that it's their duty to endure the hazard in order to demonstrate commitment or faith to some higher power? Or maybe they think that someone or something else will save them. It's not revolutionary to say that the risk to humans from climate change and natural hazards depends on how sensitive and exposed we are to them. It may be intuitive to recognize that factors such as the kind of job you have will influence how a hazard affects you. For instance, are you a fisher at the coast, where you might be exposed to tsunamis, storms, and typhoons? Or do you work in an office in the city, where your experience of such events is probably limited to reading about them on your computer screens? Of course, financial status also has an influence. If you can afford insurance, you're probably more likely to leave your home behind in the event of a major flood, rather than risk your life to save your belongings. However, if your possessions are your insurance, your only source of valuables, you may be willing to risk drowning in order to save them. But there is another dimension of life that influences how we experience climate change and natural hazards, which may not be so obvious, namely culture. Culture refers to things such as art, traditions, knowledge, folklore, religion, and material possessions that have been passed from generation to generation, and which help to create the identity of groups and people. Culture influences how we see the world. It shapes how we interpret what's going on around us, and it helps us explain and justify things, challenges, and dangers that we don't understand. You've probably heard of the Vietnamese myth of Sun Ting, the spirit of the mountains, and Tuệ Ting, the spirit of the seas, who both sought to marry the same beautiful princess. Their fight erupted into stormy waters, which Sun Ting successfully averted by moving the mountains higher. But in his frustration with defeat, Tuệ Ting tries again each year to flood the lands, and this apparently explains the monsoons in Vietnam. So it follows that culture plays an important role in defining how we think about and react to climate change and natural hazards. This helps to explain why some people deny the existence of a threat, why they don't take action to avoid death or loss of belongings, and why some people behave in ways that actually make the hazard worse. Why? Because people don't consider this hazard, which worries scientists and governments, to be a dangerous event. Instead, it may just be the manifestation of the power of some god or spirit or other important force. Religious belief is a particularly important driver of perceptions and behavior, both in harmful and helpful ways. And also non-religious belief can have the same effect. So in this talk, I focus on belief as an expression of culture. So what I've discussed so far is that belief can interact with climate change and natural hazards in two ways. First, beliefs can make people think or do things that make them more likely to be affected by a hazard. Second, people may not take a threat seriously because their beliefs lead them to consider a risk not to be a risk. Let me give you an example of how people's belief influence their reaction to risk. In El Salvador, which is a small country in Central America, far away from here, the Catholic Church was an important supporter of the rebel communities during the Civil War in the 1980s. Another Christian denomination was introduced by missionaries who wanted to take power away from the Catholic Church. The key ingredients that attracted those who were funding the missionaries were fatalism and individualism, both of which discourage taking action to change one's social situation. Ironically, this new religion, which attracted many who felt helpless in the face of such a bloody crisis, also continued to attract many who felt helpless in the face of devastating disasters, such as Hurricane Mitch, which occurred in 1998. This meant that when I was in the field for my PhD asking questions about what people did to avoid the impacts of such extreme events, there were two types of responses. Some people spoke about all the different measures that you could take to prevent the river from flooding, but others said that there was nothing that could be done because the hurricane was sent by God to test their faith, and if they suffered now, they would be better off in their afterlives. While both groups generally said that God was responsible for the hurricane, they had two completely different attitudes about what to do about them, which I later learned was a consequence of belonging to two different religious groups. So the Catholics were more proactive and were empowered by their beliefs. But those who belonged to the more fatalistic religion were essentially disempowered by their beliefs. But also the loss of traditional knowledge and belief can be a driver of risk. The ancestors of Vanuatu's Torres Islands, which is in the South Pacific, were well aware of the risk posed by tsunamis and coastal sea surges. So they built their villages on a coral platform 100 meters high. Yet, the people who are living in Torres Islands now are considered to be some of the most at risk from sea level rise caused by climate change because they're living at the coast. In this photo, you can see how they're protesting the coastal erosion that's affecting their lives. So, what happened to this ancient wisdom that taught that it was better to live away from the coast? And why did they come down from their platform? The answer lies in the black magic, which the ancestors believed was actually the reason for the hazards. Migration towards the ocean took place as the islands were being converted to Christianity, which resulted in a rejection of the black magic. Consequently, it was no longer considered that there was anything responsible for the tsunamis and coastal hazards, and the risk they posed was no longer feared. You can also find examples in wealthier countries. For 350 years, locals in the Swiss Alps had been praying for the retreat of a glacier that was continuously causing floods and avalanches. But with climate change, the glacier began to retreat very rapidly, and the locals discovered that it was affecting the availability of drinking water, food for livestock, and energy. They realized that their prayer may have been working too well. So, in 2009, they asked the Vatican to change the 350-year-old prayer to request that it instead not retreat. So what we learn from these examples, which are just a few of the many, many from around the world, is that beliefs can be both helpful and harmful. But there are a few tricky issues if our goal is to reduce the risk posed by climate change and natural hazards. The first is us versus them. Whose reality counts? Which reality is mine? Is a world in which black magic exists an alternative reality? And if so, alternative to what? How can we work with people's risk perceptions and practices without suggesting that one version of reality is superior to another, even when we know that some beliefs potentially or actually are a barrier to reducing risk? Some anthropologists suggest that there is no such thing as a universal right way of being human. In fact, a right way is almost always our way, and our way in one society almost never corresponds with our way in another society. I'm speaking to you from the perspective of somebody whose goal is to reduce the impacts of climate change and natural hazards on people's lives. That's my right way. Also, we have to ask, how important are beliefs really? Can we measure them? can beliefs be a predictor of behavior? People may say one thing because of social pressures around them, but they may not actually believe what they say. Also, finally, we need to wonder, can beliefs be integrated into mainstream work to reduce disaster and climate change risk? Or will that be too controversial, a touch on too many taboo issues? The purpose of this field of work is not to criticize religious or other belief, but it's easy to understand how it may be perceived this way, because many of the stories from the field, to some extent, characterize beliefs as harmful. The issue of how culture interacts with our experience of climate change and natural hazards is clearly not simple and provokes strong emotions from many. There's no way that we can be neutral in our exploration of this topic. Just by saying that we want to reduce risk, we're already looking through the world through our set of glasses. At the same time, problems are likely to arise if those who are designing and implementing risk reduction measures don't recognize the challenging and important role played by culture. So, even if we consider that people's beliefs are irrational and a barrier for effective risk reduction, we can't simply wish that they'll go away. We have to work with them. Thank you.